struggling ranchers rescued two enormous Apache sisters. The following morning, their chief arrived with an astounding verdict. The tempest had subsided, but what Ezekiel Marsh discovered in his homestead challenged all reason. Two Apache women lay senseless beside his perishing livestock. Yet these weren't typical women. They were titans among their tribe, each rising taller than most men when standing. The smaller one still reached beyond 6 feet, her mighty build designed for battle and endurance. The larger one was colossal, nearly 7 feet of pure strength and sinew, her shoulders wider than any pioneer Ezekiel had encountered. Apache women of this stature were myths shared around campfires, warrior daughters of chiefs raised from infancy to battle like men, yet bearing the sacred duty of preserving bloodlines. They never journeyed unaccompanied. They never materialized at struggling homesteads without complete war bands trailing them. The massive women displayed elaborate beadwork, marking them as nobility, their ornaments worth more than Ezekiel's entire holdings. Crimson seeped through the smaller one's ripped garments, while the larger one's respiration came in strained gasps. Both had sustained grave wounds, escaping something or someone perilous enough to divide them from their guardians. Every instinct Ezekiel harbored screamed one reality. Aiding Apache meant death for settlers like himself. That was the unyielding rule of this merciless wilderness. But when the enormous woman's gaze opened and met his, Ezekiel witnessed something that demolished every belief he'd maintained about Apache fighters. Not rage or loathing, but frantic human dread. The identical terror he'd experienced watching his ranch slowly perish, knowing he was helpless to prevent it. She attempted to speak, her tone deep and powerful despite her wounds, but managed only a murmur in her ancestral language before awareness vanished again. Standing above two collapsed giants who could destroy him with bare hands, Ezekiel understood that his actions in the coming moments would either brand him the greatest fool on the frontier or unveil strength he never realized he possessed. The choice that would transform everything came down to 3 minutes and 2 dying titans. Ezekiel knelt beside the unconscious Apache women, his hands shaking as he examined their injuries. Even prone, their size was intimidating. The shorter one's frame extended nearly 6.5 feet, her muscled limbs thicker than most men's legs. The taller one was a genuine giant, likely close to 7 feet tall, her broad shoulders spanning wider than Ezekiel's entrance. Both carried the lean muscle of trained fighters, their bodies built for combat and survival in harsh frontier environments. The shorter giant had received something sharp to her ribs, perhaps a branch, perhaps something worse. Dark blood stained the earth beneath her massive form, and her breathing wheezed with each exhalation. The taller one bore a wound across her brow, but her eyes remained vigilant, observing his every action with dangerous intensity that reminded him these women could break his neck effortlessly. His homestead sat 15 miles from the closest neighbor, 40 from town. Here, helping Apache meant signing his death certificate if other settlers learned of it. Men had been executed for less, accused of treachery, of choosing sides in a conflict that showed no compassion to either. The wounded giant's breathing grew more shallow. Ezekiel had witnessed enough dying cattle to recognize the symptoms. She had perhaps an hour, possibly less. "Please," the conscious giant whispered in fractured English. Her voice held a deep, authoritative tone that made clear she was used to being obeyed. "Help, sister." Ezekiel's throat constricted. The word sister struck him like a physical impact, summoning memories of his own sister, Elizabeth, lost to fever 3 winters prior. But observing these two massive women, he recognized they represented something far more dangerous than family loyalty. They were Apache royalty, warrior daughters, whose vanishing would bring entire war parties seeking answers. Thunder growled in the distance. Another storm was approaching rapidly, and 2 giants would die in his yard if he remained inactive. His neighbors would discover the bodies eventually, probably assume he'd killed them defending his property. That narrative would protect him, maybe even earn him respect in town. But as he stared into the conscious woman's face, high cheekbones weathered by wind, dark eyes that held no begging, only resigned acceptance, Ezekiel felt something fracture inside his chest. This wasn't about Apache or settlers. This was about 2 human beings bleeding out before him while he calculated the cost of his soul. "Damn it," he muttered, sliding his arms under the wounded giant's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle beneath torn fabric. Her unconscious body weighed more than a full-grown steer. The conscious giant struggled to her feet, wavering, but determined to help carry her sister. Her own imposing height made Ezekiel feel like a child beside her. Together, they maneuvered toward his cabin. Each step felt like walking toward a precipice. The wounded woman's weight nearly crushed him despite the healthy giant's assistance behind them. The wind intensified, bringing the scent of rain and something else. Dust clouds that might mean riders approaching from the southern ridge. As they reached his doorway, Ezekiel realized his cabin entrance was too narrow for the wounded giant's broad shoulders. They would have to turn her sideways, careful not to worsen her injuries. "They come," the conscious giant whispered, her grip tightening on her sister's legs as she looked toward the horizon. Soon, the riders appeared on the ridge like wolves hunting wounded prey. Ezekiel pressed his back against the cabin wall, peering through a gap in his shutters. 5 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, scanning the valley below. Even from this distance, he could see the war paint streaking their faces and the rifles slung across their backs. "Your sister," he whispered to the conscious woman who had introduced herself as Ayana. "What does she do? Why are they hunting you?" Ayana's jaw tightened as she pressed a torn cloth against her sister's wound. It spoke against marriage. The chief's son wanted her as a wife. She said no. The simplicity of it hit Ezekiel like a punch to the gut. A woman refusing marriage. And now both sisters were marked for death or capture. He thought of his own freedom to choose, to say no, to walk away from anything he didn't want. These women had no such luxury. Through the window, he watched the lead warrior raise his hand, pointing directly at Ezekiel's cabin. They had found the blood trail. "How many bullets do you have?" Ayana asked quietly, checking the knife on her belt with practiced efficiency. Ezekiel counted his ammunition, 12 rounds for his rifle, 6 for his pistol, against 5 experienced fighters who knew this terrain better than he ever would. "Not enough," he admitted. Idil's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. She spoke in rapid Apache to her sister, her voice urgent despite her weakness. Ayana's expression darkened with each word. "What did she say?" Ezekiel demanded. "The warriors are not here for us," Ayana said slowly. "They're here for you." The words made no sense. Ezekiel had never wronged the Apache, never stolen their land or killed their people. His ranch sat on territory purchased legally from the territorial government, though he knew that meant little to those who had lived here first. "Why me?" Ayana studied his face with those sharp dark eyes, as if measuring whether he could handle the truth. Outside, the warriors began their descent toward his cabin, moving with the deadly patience of experienced hunters. 3 moons ago, an Apache girl was found near death by the river. A white man brought her to our village, left her with medicine and food. He never gave his name, never asked for payment. She paused, watching recognition dawn in his eyes. You remember now? Ezekiel's breath caught. The girl by the creek, maybe 14 years old, half drowned and burning with fever. He'd found her while checking his water traps, stayed with her until she was strong enough to travel, then guided her toward Apache territory before riding away. He'd never told anyone, never expected gratitude or recognition. She was the chief's daughter, Ayanna continued. Chief Nailish swore a blood debt to the unnamed white man who saved her life. But some warriors say no debt is owed to settlers. They come to test the truth of her story. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Ezekiel realized with growing horror that this wasn't about the women he'd just sheltered. This was about a debt he never knew existed, a life he'd saved without understanding the consequences. Outside his door, the horses stopped. A voice called out in Apache, demanding and authoritative. Ayanna reached for his arm, her fingers strong and warm against his skin. What you do next, she said quietly, decides if you live as a friend or die as an enemy. The door shook under a heavy fist, and a voice called out in English, White man, we know you're inside. Come out now. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. Beside him, Ayanna helped her sister sit up against the wall, both women preparing for whatever violence might come. Idle was pale but alert, her dark eyes fixed on the door with grim determination. I'll go out, they might kill me, Ezekiel whispered. I stay inside, they'll burn us all out. No burn, Ayanna said firmly. They test your courage, not seek war. Another voice joined the first, younger and more aggressive. You help women who defy the chief's son. This makes you an enemy of the Apache people. Ezekiel recognized the trap. If he admitted to helping Ayanna and Idle, he sided against the chief's son. If he denied it, he lied to warriors who had already seen evidence of his actions. Either path led to death. But Ayanna's next words changed everything. Tell him the truth about River Girl. Tell him your name. She was asking him to claim the blood debt, to identify himself as the man who had saved the chief's daughter. It meant gambling his life on the word of a 14-year-old girl from a month ago, betting that her father valued honor above politics. The pounding grew more insistent. Through the window, Ezekiel saw two warriors moving toward his small barn where his horses were kept. They were running out of time. My name is Ezekiel Marsh, he called through the door, his voice carrying farther than he expected. 3 moons ago, I pulled Chief Nailish's daughter from the creek waters and brought her home safely. Silence fell outside. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the voice came again, it was different, older, more measured. Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh. Bring the women. Ayanna nodded to him, then helped her sister to her feet. Idle swayed but stayed upright, her hand pressed against her bandaged ribs. Together, the 3 of them approached the door. Ezekiel lifted the wooden bar and pulled the door open. 5 Apache warriors sat on their horses in his yard, wore paint sharp across their faces. But now he could see something else in their expressions. Uncertainty, maybe even respect. The leader, a man with gray threading through his black hair, studied Ezekiel with intense curiosity. You are smaller than daughter described, the warrior said. She said white man was giant who fought river spirits. Despite everything, Ezekiel almost smiled. Children always made stories larger than life. I'm just a rancher. Found her caught in fallen branches. Helped her get free. The leader's gaze shifted to Ayanna and Idle. These women brought shame to Chief's son. Why do you help them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezekiel felt the weight of 3 lives balancing on his next words. Same reason I helped your chief's daughter, he said simply. Because they needed help. The gray-haired warrior studied him for a long moment, then turned his horse toward the others. They spoke in rapid Apache, their voices low but urgent. When they finished, the leader looked back at Ezekiel with something that might have been approval. Chief Nalish comes at sunrise, he announced. He will decide if blood debt covers women's defiance. You will wait. The longest night of Ezekiel's life stretched ahead like a death sentence waiting for dawn. After the warriors disappeared into the darkness, he helped Ayanna change her sister's bandages by lamplight. Idil's wound had stopped bleeding, but infection remained a real threat. The torn flesh along her ribs looked angry and swollen, though she never complained. Will he kill me? Ezekiel asked quietly, watching Ayanna work with practiced hands. Ayanna pressed against the window, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. 3 riders, not Apache. Her voice dropped to an urgent whisper. White men with badges. Ezekiel's stomach turned to ice. If settlers had discovered Apache women in his cabin, morning's confrontation with Chief Nalish would be the least of his worries. Outside, a familiar voice called through the night. Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out slow, hands where we can see them. Deputy Marshal William Kane stepped into the lamplight, his badge catching the glow like a warning. Behind him, 2 other lawmen spread out across Ezekiel's yard, their hands resting on their gun belts with practiced ease. Marsh, we got reports of Apache in this area, Kane announced, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. Tracking party says they headed this direction after attacking the Morrison place. Ezekiel's blood went cold. If the Morrison ranch had been hit, settlers would be screaming for Apache blood. Any Apache found would be shot on sight, no questions asked. Behind him, he sensed Ayanna's massive frame tensing in the doorway. Nearly 7 feet of trained warrior ready to fight if necessary. Even wounded, she was more dangerous than all 3 lawmen combined. Idil remained motionless against the wall, but her giant form coiled with barely contained power despite her injuries. Haven't seen any Apache, Ezekiel said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. His body felt small and inadequate, blocking the entrance, knowing that 2 women, each capable of crushing these men with their bare hands, waited inside. Kane studied him with suspicious eyes. That so? Because there's blood on your porch, Marsh. Fresh blood and a lot of it. He gestured to one of his men, who immediately began examining the dark stains in the dirt. Cut myself chopping wood. Ezekiel lied smoothly. Axe slipped on wet wood, caught my arm. Show me the cut, Kane demanded. Ezekiel's mind raced. He could fake an injury, maybe use his knife to create a fresh wound. But Kane was no fool. A federal marshal would spot the difference between old blood and new, between injury and fabrication. Deputy, called the man examining the bloodstains. This ain't from one person. Different patterns, different amounts. And these footprints, he pointed to impressions in the mud. These are huge, bigger than any settler I've seen. Kane's eyes narrowed as he studied the massive footprints that clearly belonged to the giant Apache sisters. What kind of people you been hosting here, Marsh? Don't know what you mean, Ezekiel replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Kane drew his pistol. Step away from that door. We're searching your place. You got a warrant? Ezekiel asked, though he knew it didn't matter out here. Federal marshals made their own law, especially when hunting Apache. Don't need one for Indian killers, Kane replied coldly. Stand aside. Ezekiel knew he had seconds before they discovered Ayanna and Idil. Once that happened, all 3 of them were dead, the giant women for being Apache, him for harboring enemies of the territory. But as Cain stepped toward the door, Ezekiel made a desperate decision. "Wait," he called out. "You're right. There are Apache here. 2 women badly injured. They came seeking help." Cain's gun swung toward him. "You admit to harboring hostiles?" "I admit to helping 2 dying human beings," Ezekiel said firmly. "Same as I'd do for anyone else." The marshal's face twisted with disgust. "Apache sympathizer. You'll hang for this, Marsh." Behind the door, Ezekiel heard movement. The giant sisters preparing for battle. But before anyone could act, one of Cain's men called out urgently from the ridge, "Marshal, riders approaching from the north. Too dark to see. How many?" Cain spun toward the sound, his weapon forgotten for the moment. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder. "Could be more Apache," Cain muttered, then raised his voice to his men. "Defensive positions. We'll settle with Marsh after we see who's coming." As the lawmen scrambled for cover, Ezekiel realized that reinforcements were arriving. But whether they came as salvation or doom would depend entirely on who rode through the darkness toward his cabin. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, carrying with it the weight of judgment that would arrive with the dawn. The riders that appeared in the darkness weren't Apache. They were more federal agents, reinforcements that Cain had called for backup. "Marshal Cain," the lead rider called out, dismounting quickly. "We've got orders from the territorial governor. All Apache harbored by settlers are to be brought in for questioning about the Morrison killings." Cain's confidence returned with the additional support. Now 6 armed lawmen surrounded Ezekiel's property, making resistance impossible. "Search every building," Cain ordered. "Bring out anyone you find." Ezekiel's heart pounded as he realized his confession had doomed them all. Within minutes, Ayanna and Idil would be discovered, and all 3 of them would be dead or imprisoned. But Ayanna surprised everyone by stepping out of the cabin voluntarily, her massive frame filling the doorway before she emerged into the lamplight. Even the hardened marshals stepped back involuntarily. None had ever seen an Apache woman of her size and bearing. She carried herself like royalty, her nearly 7-foot frame moving with deadly grace despite her injuries. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nailish," she announced in clear English. "This man saved my sister's life when she was dying. Apache law protects those who show mercy to our people." Idil followed her sister outside, her own imposing height and muscled frame making the marshals exchange nervous glances. These weren't ordinary Apache women. They were giants among their people, trained warriors who could kill with their bare hands. Cain raised his rifle toward the sisters. "Apache law doesn't mean anything to federal marshals. You're coming with us." "No," Ayanna said simply, her deep voice carrying absolute authority. "We are not." "You don't have a choice," Cain replied, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Something about these giant women's confidence suggested they knew something he didn't. Ayanna smiled, a cold expression that reminded Ezekiel of her father. "My father comes at sunrise. He will speak for us then. Until sunrise, we remain under the protection of the blood debt owed to this man." "What blood debt?" Cain demanded. Idil stepped forward, her massive frame casting shadows across the yard. 3 moons ago, a white rancher saved the chief's youngest daughter from drowning. Apache law says life debt must be honored. This man called in the debt tonight when he helped us." The marshals exchanged glances. They had heard of Apache blood debts, sacred obligations that even war parties honored. But they had never encountered a situation where a white settler could claim such protection. "That's Indian superstition," Cain said, but his voice lacked conviction. Federal law supersedes tribal customs. Does it? Ayanna asked quietly. Then explain why the territorial governor signed a treaty last winter recognizing Apache legal customs in matters involving tribal members. Kane's face went pale. The treaty was real, a political necessity to avoid all-out war. If these women were really Chief Nailish daughters, and if Ezekiel could prove he'd saved another daughter, then federal law would be forced to recognize the blood debt until the chief himself could rule on it. "We'll wait until morning," Kane finally said. "But if your father doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal requirements, all three of you are coming with us." As the marshals established a perimeter around the property, Ezekiel realized that everything now depended on what Chief Nailish would decide when he arrived with the sun. The giant sisters had bought them one night, but morning would bring judgment that could mean life or death for all of them. Ayanna moved closer to Ezekiel, her imposing presence both protective and comforting. "Father is a wise man," she said quietly, "but wisdom sometimes requires difficult choices." Looking at the armed men surrounding his property, Ezekiel understood that Chief Nailish's decision wouldn't just determine their fate. It would set a precedent for how Apache and federal law interacted on the frontier. As the long night wore on, all they could do was wait for sunrise and hope that wisdom would prove stronger than politics. When judgment finally came, dawn broke with the sound of approaching horses, exactly as Ayanna had promised. Ezekiel stood in his doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night spent watching federal marshals patrol his property. The giant sisters had maintained their vigil beside him, their imposing frames serving as both protection and a reminder of what was at stake. Marshal Kane emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, rifle ready as dust clouds appeared on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called to Ayanna, "because if it's a war party, we'll start shooting." Ayanna straightened to her full, intimidating height, her nearly 7 feet of trained muscle casting a long shadow in the morning light. "My father comes as promised. He will speak Apache law and federal law both." The riders materialized from the dust, not the massive war party Kane had feared, but Chief Nailish with a carefully chosen group of 5 elders, their faces painted for a formal ceremony. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to show respect for both Apache tradition and federal authority. Chief Nailish dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Ezekiel had expected, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the lean strength of a survivor. Most striking were his eyes, intelligent, calculating, and completely unintimidated by the armed marshals surrounding him. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in perfect English, somehow knowing the lawman's name, "you hold my daughters as prisoners. This creates a problem between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "Your daughters murdered settlers at the Morrison place. They're wanted for questioning under federal law. Morrison tried to force himself on my daughters." Chief Nailish replied with dangerous calm. "They defended their honor. Apache law justifies their actions. Federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving tribal members." The legal chess match had begun. Ezekiel watched as 2 experienced negotiators circled each other with words instead of weapons, each seeking advantage through law rather than force. "Even if that's true," Kane said, "harboring fugitives is a federal crime. This rancher broke the law helping them." Chief Nailish turned his attention to Ezekiel, studying him with intense focus. "You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from drowning in the creek." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel managed, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. For this, Apache law says I owe you blood debt. Life for life. The chief's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. But you also saved 2 more of my daughters when they were dying. This makes the debt very complicated. Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, her massive frame both protective and supportive. Chief, she said formally, this man risked everything to help us. He is worthy of Apache respect. Chief Nailish nodded slowly, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something that made everyone go still, a necklace of carved bone and silver, the kind worn only by Apache family members of the highest rank. 3 lives saved creates obligation beyond simple blood debt, the chief announced, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. Ezekiel Marsh, you have proven yourself worthy of adoption into Apache family. You become my son through deed and honor. Kane's rifle trembled in his hands. You can't just declare American territory as Indian land. The federal government recognizes treaty rights. Chief Nailish interrupted smoothly. Treaty says Apache can adopt members, claim family lands. Your own law protects adopted Apache family members from persecution. The brilliance of the decision struck Ezekiel like lightning. In one move, the chief had solved every problem. Protection for his daughters, legal immunity for Ezekiel, and a way to claim valuable ranch land under federal treaty law. Ezekiel Marsh, Chief Nailish continued. Do you accept adoption? Do you take my daughters as your sisters, my people as your people? Looking at Ayanna and Idil, 2 giant warriors who had trusted him with their lives, Ezekiel realized this was more than legal protection. It was transformation, belonging, and the chance to bridge 2 worlds that had only known war. I accept, he said clearly. Chief Nailish stepped forward and placed a necklace around Ezekiel's neck. The weight of it felt like chains and freedom combined. Kane holstered his weapon with obvious frustration, knowing he had been outmaneuvered completely. This isn't over. There will be federal investigations. Let them come, Chief Nailish said with quiet confidence. Apache law is clear. Federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and daughters are under tribal protection now. But as the chief prepared to leave with his elders, he turned back to Ezekiel with something that might have been amusement in his ancient eyes. Son, he said quietly, tomorrow I return with a different decision. Tonight, think carefully about what adoption truly means. The next day, Chief Nailish returned with a decision that would change everything forever. Ezekiel stood in his yard, still wearing the adoption necklace that had made him part of the Apache family, still uncertain about what the chief's cryptic words about a different decision had meant. Beside him, Ayanna towered in all her 7-foot glory, her massive frame casting shadows across the ground as she watched her father approach with a small group of elders. The months following his adoption had been a revelation. His failing ranch had transformed into a thriving trading post where Apache families came to exchange goods with white settlers under federal treaty protection. The Giant Sisters had proven invaluable. Idil's imposing presence and sharp mind for business made negotiations smooth and profitable, while Ayanna's incredible strength helped with construction and heavy labor that would have taken Ezekiel weeks to complete alone. But success came with complications he hadn't anticipated. Every day spent working alongside Ayanna, watching her move with deadly grace despite her towering size, feeling the quiet intelligence behind her dark eyes, had made his feelings for her impossible to ignore. She was his sister by Apache law now, protected by rules that carried death sentences for violation. You struggle with adoption, Ayanna had observed the day before, her own 6.5-foot frame making even ordinary conversations feel momentous. Apache law protects family, but some protections become prisons. Now, as Chief Nailish dismounted with ceremonial dignity, Ezekiel wondered if the older man had somehow sensed the impossible situation he'd created. "My son," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "you have honored adoption well. Apache people see your worth, your protection of those who needed shelter." He paused, studying Ezekiel's expression. "But I am an old man, and old men sometimes solve one problem while creating another." Ezekiel felt his heart race as the chief's calculating gaze moved between him and Ayanna. "When I made you brother to my daughters," Chief Nailish continued, "I solved the problem of law. But I created the problem of heart." He gestured to the giant woman standing beside Ezekiel. "Ayanna is a warrior trained to fight and lead, but she is also a woman who chooses her own path. Apache law respects such choices." Ayanna stepped forward, her imposing height making even her father look small by comparison. "Chief," she said formally, "I choose to speak." "Speak then, daughter." Her deep voice carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "Brother has shown honor beyond any white man I have known. His heart is true, his courage proven." She paused, meeting Ezekiel's eyes directly. "My heart sees him not as brother, but as a man worthy of a different bond." Chief Nailish smiled, the same calculating expression that had terrified federal marshals. "Apache law has a solution for this too. A brother who proves himself worthy can be released from family bond by the chief's word, if the other family agrees." He turned to Idle. "Younger daughter, what say you?" Idle's massive frame straightened to its full impressive height. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from brotherhood. He has earned the right to choose his own path." She grinned, her smile transforming her imposing features. "And sister has waited long enough for happiness." "Then I speak the final decision," Chief Nailish announced, his voice echoing with authority. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. He is no longer my son by law." The words hung in the air like smoke. "But if he chooses, he can become my son by marriage, if my giant daughter agrees to have him." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Apache traditions blended with territorial law, creating a marriage that was legal in both worlds. Federal authorities, still smarting from their earlier legal defeat, could only watch as Ezekiel married into one of the most powerful Apache families in the territory. Idle served as witness, her laughter ringing across the valley as she watched her sister's joy. Standing nearly 7 feet tall in traditional wedding dress, Ayanna was a sight that took every witness's breath away. A giant among women, beautiful and deadly, choosing love over duty. The trading post prospered beyond all expectations. The unusual sight of 2 giant Apache sisters working alongside their new brother-in-law became legend across the territory. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the women who stood taller than most men and could outwork any 3 ordinary people. Federal investigations ceased entirely when Washington realized the political value of a peaceful trading relationship. The small ranch that had once meant failure became the foundation of a new kind of frontier community where size meant respect and strength served peace. Chief Nailish's truly shocking decision had been revealed, not just adopting a white settler, but orchestrating an intricate legal chess game that freed his daughter to marry for love while maintaining tribal honor and federal protection. 6 months later, as Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct construction of their expanded home, he realized that some of life's greatest blessings come disguised as impossible complications. The giant Apache sisters had brought him not just love and prosperity, but a place in a world larger than any he had imagined possible. The 3 women occupied his barn as if it belonged to them. No questions, no explanations, simply waiting. Eli had never encountered them in his entire existence. Yet somehow they had discovered precisely where he concealed the hidden key beneath the warped plank. They understood his identity. They recognized his solitary existence. The eldest clutched a leather satchel that rattled with currency, more wealth than Eli had witnessed in decades. But when he extended his reach toward it, she withdrew it with a calculating grin, as though this was all part of some contest he couldn't comprehend. "The chief predicted you'd attempt to decline," she declared in flawless English, though her pronunciation carried something unfamiliar, something that didn't correspond to any nation he recognized from these regions. That should have been inconceivable. The closest tribal territories were 3 days' journey north, and no chief had ever stepped onto his land. Hell, no chief had ever concerned himself with a struggling cattleman losing his property to the lending institution. But then the youngest sister interjected. "He informed us you'd inquire about the wound." Eli's hand reflexively moved to his shoulder, where an ancient injury remained concealed beneath his garment, a wound that only 3 individuals had ever discovered: his father, who was deceased, the physician who attended it, who'd relocated east years prior, and a tribal healer who discovered him bleeding in the wasteland 15 years past. A man whose features Eli could scarcely recall, but whose declaration still resonated in his consciousness. "Someday I will dispatch my daughters to retrieve what you owe." The women weren't merely random outsiders. They were present because of something that had occurred long before this instance. Something Eli had apparently consented to in a fevered vision of agony and appreciation when he was 19 and perishing. But the healer had only referenced daughters, not 3 sisters who appeared completely different, spoke with varying accents and wore garments that seemed to originate from entirely different tribes. And if the chief had dispatched them to retrieve a debt, why did the currency in that satchel feel like compensation, not collection? Eli's limbs felt unstable as the recollection returned forcefully. The desert temperature, blood saturating through his shirt. An elderly man with worn hands cleansing his wound, speaking in fragmented English about dignity and obligations that must be settled. "You pledged him 3 animals," the eldest woman persisted, studying his expression. "But you possessed no animals. So he declared you would provide him something more precious when the moment arrived." The middle sister advanced forward, and Eli finally observed their actual stature. These weren't typical women. Each stood nearly as elevated as him, with wide shoulders and muscular arms that indicated strenuous work. Their attendants filled the modest barn like 3 mighty trees positioned too closely together. "I'm Nora," the eldest announced, her voice unwavering. "This is Cora, and that's Will," she indicated to her sisters, who acknowledged but stayed quiet. "Our father dispatched us here because his time is diminishing. The white man's disease claimed most of our people. Only we 3 survive of his lineage." Eli's mouth became parched. "Your father, the medicine man." "Chief Ayana," Nora amended. "He assumed leadership when the previous one perished last winter. And yes, he recalled a foolish boy who pledged whatever the chief required in exchange for his existence." The burden of 15 years descended upon Eli's chest. He recalled now the fevered declarations, the desperate thankfulness. But he'd been dying. People utter insane things when they're dying. "I don't comprehend," he stated, though part of him was starting to. "Why you? Why here? Why now?" Well, the youngest laughed bitterly. "Because the soldiers are advancing on our territory next month. Because we require protection that only a white man's identity can provide us. Because you owe a debt." Cora spoke for the initial time, her voice gentler than her sister's. "Father is dying. His final desire is to witness us secure. A marriage to a landowner would grant us legal position, provide us an opportunity. Eli surveyed his deteriorating ranch, the drooping roof, the vacant enclosure, the fields he could scarcely manage to cultivate. Safe here. I'm 3 months overdue on my loan. The bank's arriving to seize this place. Nora reached into her leather satchel and extracted a handful of gold pieces. More wealth than Eli's ranch was valued. Father's reserves. The remainder of what our people possessed. It's yours if you respect your promise. The coin sparkled in the afternoon illumination streaming through the barn entrance. Sufficient to preserve his land, repair the roof, purchase livestock. Everything he envisioned. But 3 spouses, enormous women from a dying tribe who spoke of debts and pledges he barely recalled making. I require time to consider, he declared. Time is what we lack, Nora responded. The soldiers advance at sunrise. Father anticipates an answer before dusk. She paused, her dark eyes penetrating his. He also instructed to inform you about the additional pledge. Eli's blood became frigid. There had been another pledge, one he'd hoped the elderly man had forgotten. The additional pledge. Eli's hand started to tremble as the memory emerged like a stone cast into motionless water. If you ever violate your promise to me, he'd murmured to the medicine man, delirious with fever, may my lineage conclude with me. It had seemed insignificant then, the desperate vow of a dying youth. But now observing 3 women who could effortlessly overpower him, the words felt like a rope around his neck. He recalls, Willa declared, noting his pale complexion. She approached closer, and Eli detected the aroma of leather and would smoke on her clothing. Good. That makes this simpler. Cora retrieved a rolled document from her belt, a marriage agreement written in English, witnessed by the territorial judge in Prescott. All legal and appropriate. She spread it on a hay bundle. 3 wives, 1 husband. Completely legal in this territory if all parties agree. Eli stared at the document. The penmanship was exact, official. Someone had arranged this meticulously. How did you obtain a judge to compose this? Gold purchases many things, Nora stated simply, including discretion. The barn entrance creaked, and all 4 turned toward the sound. A figure stood outlined against the setting sun, tall, lean, wearing a mixture of tribal clothing and frontier attire. Eli's breath stopped. Chief Ayana appeared exactly as Eli remembered, but older, grayer, thinner, the kind of thin that speaks of sickness consuming from within. My daughters have explained, the chief inquired in English, entering the barn. His voice carried the weight of exhaustion. They've explained plenty, Eli stated, discovering his courage. But I never consented to marry anyone. I was 19 and dying. People declare things when they're dying. The chief nodded slowly. Yes, they do. I declared many things when I was dying last month. But a white doctor in Prescott provided me medicine, purchased me time. He coughed, and Eli witnessed specks of blood on his lips. Time to maintain my portion of the agreement. What agreement? I preserved your life. You pledged me whatever I required. Now I require my daughters to survive what's approaching. The chief's eyes hardened. The cavalry burned for villages last month. Ours is next, but wives of a white rancher, they'll be protected. We'll step between Eli and her father. He doesn't desire us. Observe him, frightened of his own reflection. I'm not frightened, Eli snapped, his pride stinging. I'm being realistic. I can barely nourish myself, let alone 3. 3 enormous women, Cora completed with a bitter smile on her lips. Stated, we've heard worse. The chief coughed again, more forcefully this time. When he looked up, there was blood on his chin. The sickness advances rapidly now. I have days, not weeks. Decide, Eli Thompson. Honor your word or face the consequences of violating it. What consequences? Nora's hand moved to something concealed beneath her jacket. Father isn't the only one who remembers pledges. The entire tribe knows what you owe us. Outside, Eli heard the sound he'd been fearing all day. Hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Multiple riders. Who's that? He whispered. The chief smiled grimly. That would be my nephews coming to hear your answer. 4 riders emerged from the dust cloud, their horses lathered with sweat. Young men, maybe 20 to 25, with the hardened look of warriors who'd witnessed too much death. They dismounted with practiced efficiency, their hands never far from the knives at their belts. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his cheek, strode into the barn. Uncle, he said in English, then switched to rapid tribal language that Eli couldn't understand. Chief Ayanna responded sharply, and Eli caught the tension in his voice. Whatever was being discussed, it wasn't good. Speak English, Joseph, Nora commanded. Mr. Thompson deserves to understand what concerns his future. Joseph's dark eyes fixed on Eli with open hostility. Future? This coward has no future. The cavalry found our camp 2 hours ago. They're asking questions about 3 missing women. He spat in the dirt. Women who should be helping us prepare for war, not hiding behind a white man's name. War? Eli's voice cracked. What war? The war that started when they burned the Wickham village, Willa said, her hand moving to rest on a hunting knife. 43 people dead, including children. The barn fell silent, except for the chief's labored breathing. Eli looked from face to face, seeing the grief and rage they'd been hiding behind calm words. The soldiers will come here next, Joseph continued. They're tracking footprints, following the trail. When they find these women, he gestured at the sisters, they'll kill us all. Cora stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear Eli could see in her eyes. Not if we're legally married. Not if we have protection under white man's law. Law. Joseph laughed bitterly. The same law that says we can't own land. That says we're not citizens. That says they can kill us for sport. Chief Ayanna raised his hand, and the argument stopped. Enough. He turned to Eli, and in the dim light, his face looked like a death mask. The choice is simple now. Marry my daughters and give them protection, or watch them die when the soldiers arrive. Eli's throat felt dry as sand. When will they get here? Before dawn, Joseph said. Maybe sooner if they push their horses. Eli gazed at the 3 women, really gazed at them. Despite their size and strength, he could see the exhaustion in their faces. The way they held themselves like people carrying an unbearable burden. They weren't conquerors or threats. They were refugees. If I say yes, he said slowly, what happens to you and your nephews? The chief smiled sadly. We disappear into the mountains, live like spirits until the anger subsides. He coughed again, more blood speckling his lips. If I live that long. And if I say no, then we all perish here together, Nora said simply, because we won't flee anymore. Outside, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the prairie, but the sky had been clear all day. That's not thunder, Joseph said, his hand moving to his knife. That's horses. A lot of them. Chief Ayanna closed his eyes. They're early. The ground vibrated under their feet as the sound grew closer. 20 horses, maybe more, moving fast across the hard pan. Hide in the root cellar, Eli said quickly. All of you, I'll tell them I haven't seen anyone. Joseph laughed harshly. You think they'll just take your word? They'll search every building, every hole. He pulled his knife. Better to die fighting. Put that away, Nora snapped. Violence will only prove their point. She turned to Eli, and for the first time he saw vulnerability in her dark eyes. But he's right about one thing. They won't believe you. Cora moved to the barn window, peering through a crack in the boards. 12 soldiers, led by a captain with yellow stripes on his sleeve. She looked back at Eli. Do you know him? Eli's stomach dropped. Captain Morrison. He's been here before. What for? Willa demanded, asking about my mortgage payments. The bank hired him to pressure me into selling. Eli ran his hands through his hair. He knows I'm desperate. If he finds you here, he'll assume we're criminals. You're hiding for money, Nora finished, which makes you guilty too. The hoofbeats were close enough now to hear individual horses. Chief Ayanna struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against a wooden post. There's something else you need to know, he said to Eli, before you decide. No. Joseph hissed. Uncle, this isn't the time for... It's exactly the time. The chief's eyes locked onto Eli's. My daughters aren't just refugees. They're wanted. Eli felt his blood turn to ice. Wanted for what? Will stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. We killed the men who burned our village. The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He stared at the 3 women, seeing them with new eyes. Not refugees, fugitives. How many men? He whispered. 6, Cora said calmly. They came to our camp drunk, looking for easy targets. They set fire to the sacred lodge with elders inside. Her voice remained steady, but her hands clenched into fists. So we tracked them back to their camp and cut their throats while they slept. Jesus Christ, Eli breathed. They were murderers, Nora said, but we're the ones with bounties on our heads. The hoofbeats stopped outside the barn. Eli could hear men dismounting, voices calling orders. Morrison's voice rose above the others. Thompson, come out here. Chief Ayanna grabbed Eli's arm with surprising strength. Now you know the truth. Marry them, and you're harboring known killers. Refuse, and you're still harboring known killers. His eyes burned with fever and desperation. But if they're your wives, you can't be forced to testify against them. Thompson? Morrison's voice was closer now, right outside the barn door. Open up. We need to talk. Eli looked at the 3 sisters. They stood ready to fight, ready to die, ready to face whatever came next. They weren't asking for his love or even his understanding. They were asking for his name. And somehow, looking at their faces, he realized they were also offering him something he'd never had. A reason to be more than just a failed rancher waiting to lose everything. The barn door rattled as someone tested the latch. 1 minute, Morrison called out. Then we're coming in. Eli's hand moved to the marriage contract still spread on the hay bale. His fingers traced the official seal as his mind raced through impossible choices. I need a pen, he whispered. Nora's eyes widened. Cora pulled a pencil from her belt and pressed it into his palm. Without hesitation, Eli scrawled his name across the bottom line, then grabbed Nora's hand and guided her to sign as well. Quickly, he hissed to Cora and Willa. Both of you. As the sisters signed, Eli turned to Joseph and the other nephews. You're my ranch hands. Been working here all summer. Keep your mouth shut and follow my lead. The barn door flew open, and Captain Morrison strode in with 3 soldiers behind him. He was a thin man with cold blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't hide the cruel twist of his mouth. Thompson, Morrison said, his gaze sweeping the barn. Interesting company you're keeping. Eli stepped forward, trying to block Morrison's view of the chief, who was slumped against the wall. looking more dead than alive. "Captain, what brings you out here so late?" "We're tracking dangerous fugitives. 3 native women who murdered 6 white men." Morrison's hand rested on his pistol grip. "Witnesses saw them heading this direction." "Haven't seen any women," Eli said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just hired some new hands to help with the harvest." Morrison's eyes fixed on Nora, taking in her size and obvious femininity, despite her practical clothes. "That's a mighty big ranch hand you got there, Thompson." Eli felt sweat beading on his forehead. "This is my wife, Nora Thompson. Just married this afternoon." The silence stretched like a taut rope. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Nora's face, then moved to Cora and Willa. "Your wife's got sisters, does she?" "My other wives," Eli said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Cora and Willa Thompson, all legal and proper." One of Morrison's soldiers snorted. "3 wives? What kind of man?" "The kind who follows territorial law," Eli interrupted. "Polygamy is legal here with proper documentation." He held up the marriage certificate, witnessed and sealed in Prescott yesterday. Morrison snatched the document and examined it closely. His jaw tightened as he read the official language, the judge's signature, the legal seals. Everything was legitimate. "Convenient timing," Morrison said finally. "Marrying 3 native women right when we're hunting 3 native murderers." "My wives are from the Tohono-O'odham," Eli lied smoothly. "Peaceful farmers from the south. Never been anywhere near the Wickham village." Nora stepped forward, and Eli marveled at how she seemed to shrink herself, making her imposing frame appear smaller and less threatening. "Captain, sir," she said in perfect English with just a hint of accent. "We've been traveling for weeks to reach my husband's ranch. We know nothing of any troubles." Morrison's gaze shifted to the chief, still slumped against the wall. "And him?" "My father-in-law," Eli said. "Sick with fever. We're caring for him." Joseph stepped up beside his uncle, supporting him with obvious family affection. "The sickness took many of our people. Father is all we have left." Morrison studied each face, looking for tells, for fear, for any sign of deception. But all he saw were tired people trying to care for a dying man. Finally, he thrust the marriage certificate back at Eli. "If I find out you're lying to me, Thompson, I'll see you hang alongside them." "I understand, Captain." Morrison signaled his men, and they began filing out of the barn. But at the doorway, he paused and looked back. "I'll be watching this place, Thompson. Any trouble, any sign these women aren't what they claim to be, and I'll be back." As the soldiers mounted their horses and rode away, Eli's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The silence that followed Morrison's departure felt heavier than the thunderstorm clouds gathering overhead. Eli stared at the marriage certificate in his hands, the ink still wet from their signatures. 3 wives. He'd gone from bachelor to polygamist in the span of 5 minutes. "Thank you," Nora said quietly. "That was brave." "Stupid, more likely," Eli replied, though he couldn't deny the strange sense of purpose that had filled him when he signed that paper. "Morrison's not done with us. He'll be back." Joseph helped his uncle to a sitting position against the hay bales. The chief's breathing had grown more labored, each breath a visible struggle. "Uncle needs rest and medicine." Eli looked at the dying man who had saved his life 15 years ago. "There's a doctor in town, but no doctors," Chief Ayana whispered. "Too dangerous. The sickness will take me whether I die in a bed or under the stars." He fixed his eyes on Eli. "But my daughters are safe now. That's what matters." Willa moved to the barn door, keeping watch for any sign of returning soldiers. "They'll come back tomorrow, maybe with more men." "Then we'll be ready," Cora said. But Eli caught the uncertainty in her voice. Ready? How? Eli asked. I don't know the first thing about being a husband to one woman, let alone 3. Nora surprised him by laughing, a rich, warm sound that seemed to ease some of the tension in the barn. You think we know how to share a husband? This is new territory for all of us. The observation hung in the air as they all contemplated the strange situation they'd created. Eli found himself studying his new wives, really looking at them as individuals for the first time. Nora, the eldest, carried herself with natural authority, even when she'd made herself smaller for Morrison's benefit. There was a dignity about her that reminded Eli of his own mother. Practical, strong, unbreakable. Cora watched everything with intelligent eyes, calculating, measuring. She'd been the one to think about legal documentation, to plan ahead, the strategist of the family. And Willa, the youngest, burned with barely contained energy. She reminded Eli of a caged mountain cat, beautiful, dangerous, and ready to explode into action at any moment. We'll need to be convincing, Cora said, ever practical. If Morrison comes back and finds us sleeping in the barn like strangers, he'll know something's wrong. Eli felt heat rise in his cheeks. The house only has 2 bedrooms. Then we'll make do, Nora said matter-of-factly. Married people share space. It's what Morrison will expect to see. Joseph and his companions gathered their few belongings. We'll camp in the hills, he told his uncle. Close enough to help if needed. Far enough to stay hidden. Chief Ayanna reached out and grasped Eli's hand with surprising strength. Protect them, he wheezed. They're all that's left of our bloodline. All that's left of who we were. I will, Eli promised and meant it. As Joseph and the others melted into the darkness, Eli led his new family toward the house. The building looked smaller than usual, with 3 large women following behind him. There's something else, Willa said as they reached the porch. Something Father didn't tell you. Eli's stomach clenched. What now? The bounty on our heads. It's not just from a territorial government. She met his eyes in the lamplight. The dead men's families put up their own reward. $500 each, dead or alive. $1,500. More money than most people saw in a lifetime. Every bounty hunter from here to California will be coming for us, Cora added quietly, as if summoned by her words. The distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the prairie again. Eli extinguished the lamp and moved to the window. 3 riders approached slowly, their silhouettes dark against the starlit sky. These weren't soldiers. They moved with the careful deliberation of men who hunted for money. Bounty hunters, Willa whispered, confirming his fears. Nora positioned herself by the back door while Cora moved to the side window. Without discussion, they'd spread out to cover all exits. The coordination spoke of experience and desperation. How do we play this? Eli asked. Same as before, Nora said. We're your wives. Married, legal, protected. They won't care about legal, Cora said grimly. $1,500 makes men forget about law. The riders stopped 50 yards from the house. Eli could see them conferring, planning their approach. One dismounted and began walking toward the front door while the other 2 rode to flank the building. Professional, Willa observed. They've done this before. A knock echoed through the small house. Polite, almost friendly. Mr. Thompson, sorry to bother you so late. We're looking for some missing women. Thought you might have seen them. Eli opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latched. The bounty hunter was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes that didn't match the gun on his hip. Name's Fletcher, the man said. We're tracking 3 native women who murdered some folks up north. Big women traveling together. You seen anyone like that? Just my wives, Eli said. We were married yesterday. Fletcher's smile never wavered, but his eyes sharpened. Mind if I meet them? Always nice to congratulate newlyweds. Eli's mouth went dry. There was no refusing without raising suspicion. Of course. Come in. He unlatched the door, and Fletcher stepped inside. The other two hunters remained outside, close enough to help, far enough to avoid being trapped. Nora emerged from the kitchen carrying a coffee pot, as if she'd been preparing for guests. The domestic scene should have looked natural, but Eli caught Fletcher studying her size, her movements, the way she held herself. "Ma'am," Fletcher said politely, "congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," Nora replied. "Coffee. That's kind of you." Fletcher accepted a cup, but didn't drink. "Your husband says you were married yesterday. Where was the ceremony?" "Prescott," Cora said, entering from the bedroom with Willa behind her. "Judge Morrison performed it." Fletcher's eyebrows rose at seeing 3 women. 3 wives. That's unusual. "Legal in this territory," Eli said quickly. "Oh, I know it's legal." Fletcher set down his untouched coffee. "It's just that the women I'm tracking are also 3 sisters, also unusually large. What are the odds?" The silence stretched taut. Eli could feel his wives preparing to fight, muscles coiling like springs. Outside, one of the horses snorted nervously. "I'll tell you what the odds are," Fletcher continued conversationally. "Pretty slim. So I'm thinking maybe we need to take a closer look at your marriage certificate." "It's legal," Eli insisted. "I'm sure it is, but legal doesn't mean legitimate." Fletcher's hand moved casually toward his gun. "See, I've been hunting fugitives for 12 years, and in my experience, when 3 wanted women disappear and 3 wives suddenly appear in the same area." He shrugged. "Well, coincidences make me nervous." Willa stepped forward, and Eli saw the hunting knife in her hand. "Maybe you should leave." Fletcher's friendly mask finally dropped. "And maybe you should come with me quietly. Dead or alive, the bounty pays the same." That's when Chief Ayanna walked through the front door. The old man looked like death itself, pale, shaking, supported by Joseph and one of his nephews. But he was alive, and he was carrying something that made Fletcher's face go white. A badge, silver, and official with territorial markings. "Deputy Chief Ayanna." The old man wheezed, showing the badge. "Territorial Marshal's Office. These women are under my protection." Fletcher stared at the badge, then at the dying man holding it. That's impossible." "Check the files in Prescott," Ayanna said, his voice gaining strength from some final reserve. "I've been working undercover for 6 months, tracking the real killers. These women are my operatives." It was a desperate lie, but told with such conviction that even Eli almost believed it. Fletcher studied the badge for a long moment. His weathered face creased with doubt. Undercover marshals don't marry their operatives to civilians. "They do when it's the only way to maintain cover," Ayanna replied, though Eli could see the effort each word cost him. "The Real killers are white men dressed as natives, trying to start a war between the tribes and settlers." It was brilliant in its simplicity, a lie that explained everything while giving Fletcher a face-saving way to retreat. "I'll need to verify this in Prescott," Fletcher said finally. "Of course," Ayanna nodded. "Marshal Davidson will confirm everything." Fletcher holstered his gun and headed for the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Eli. "You're either the luckiest man in the territory or the unluckiest. Time will tell which." As the bounty hunters rode away, Chief Ayanna collapsed into Joseph's arms. The badge fell from his fingers, clattering on the wooden floor. "Where did you get that?" Eli asked, kneeling beside the dying man. Ayanna smiled weakly. "Took it off A dead marshal 3 years ago. Been saving it for something important. His breathing grew shallower. Thought tonight qualified. Over the next hour, they watched Chief Ayana slip away peacefully, surrounded by his daughters and nephews. His last words were in his native tongue, something that made Nora weep for the first time since Eli had met her. He said we should be happy, she translated, that we found a good man. Joseph and the other nephews took their uncle's body into the hills for burial according to tribal custom. They left before dawn, disappearing into the wilderness like ghosts. As the sun rose over the prairie, Eli found himself alone with his 3 wives for the first time. The weight of their new reality settled over them like morning mist. So, Willa said, breaking the awkward silence. What now? Eli looked around his small house, trying to imagine how 4 people would share the cramped space. I suppose we figure out how to make this work. The sleeping arrangements alone, Cora began, then stopped, color rising in her cheeks. We'll manage, Nora said firmly. We've survived worse than an overcrowded house. Over the following weeks, they did manage better than Eli had dared hope. Nora took charge of the ranch's finances, using her father's gold to pay off the mortgage and invest in livestock. Her business sense proved as sharp as her survival instincts. Cora organized their daily lives with military precision, creating schedules and systems that turned chaos into efficiency. Under her guidance, the failing ranch began to thrive. And Willa brought laughter back into Eli's life. Her fierce joy and unbreakable spirit reminded him what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. The arrangement that had begun as desperate necessity slowly evolved into something deeper. Not romantic love, not yet, perhaps not ever in the traditional sense, but respect, affection, and a profound sense of partnership. When Captain Morrison returned a month later to check on them, he found a prosperous ranch run by a confident man and his capable wives. The transformation was so complete that Morrison left without asking a single probing question. You know, Eli said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, when your father said I'd be your husband, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. And now, Nora asked. Eli looked at each of his wives, strong women who had saved his ranch, his purpose, and maybe his soul. Now I think it might be the best. As the stars emerged overhead, Eli Thompson, no longer a failing rancher, but a man with a family worth fighting for, finally understood what Chief Ayana had seen in him all those years ago. Not just someone who owed a debt, but someone capable of honoring it. And in honoring that debt, he'd found something he'd never expected, a place where he belonged. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. The property deed weighed more than expected in Boone Whitmore's calloused palms as he gazed at the farmhouse that should have been vacant. 3 women occupied the porch like guardians, their formidable silhouettes creating elongated shadows across the timber boards. The most towering, possessing arms capable of subduing a charging steer, advanced with a grin that failed to warm her icy blue gaze. You must be the recent purchaser, she declared, her tone bearing the authority of someone familiar with commanding respect. Yet something additional lurked in her voice, something that raised the fine hairs along Boone's nape. The remaining 2 women positioned themselves at her flanks, equally statuesque and powerful, observing him with the focus of hunters evaluating their quarry. Boone had journeyed 3 arduous days across challenging landscape to arrive at this isolated holding. His entire fortune was committed to what the vendor had guaranteed was rich soil, ideal for livestock operations. The remoteness had attracted him, an opportunity to begin anew distant from urban complications. Now standing in the dusty courtyard with these three strangers occupying his territory, that seclusion felt more like entrapment. "Ladies, I believe there's been some misunderstanding," Boone stated, maintaining vocal control despite the anxiety creeping along his spine. "This property belongs to me now. I possess the legal documentation right here." He displayed the deed, its official stamp still pristine and fresh. The woman's smile broadened, exposing teeth that appeared unnaturally keen. "Oh, we understand precisely who you are, Boone Whitmore. We've been anticipating your arrival." Her pronunciation of his name sent frost through his veins. How had she learned his identity? The vendor had promised the transaction was confidential, that nobody else knew of the acquisition. "We've been residing here for considerable time," the second woman interjected, her voice deeper than her companion's. "Maintaining the property, keeping it inhabited." She stressed the final phrase in a manner that tightened Boone's stomach with an unnamed emotion. The third woman, an auburn-haired individual with freckles dotting her muscular shoulders, released a low chuckle. "The former owner established certain understandings with us before departing. Understandings that don't simply vanish because of documentation." Boone experienced the weight of their scrutiny like physical force against his torso. These weren't typical squatters or confused neighbors. Something intentional characterized their presence, something calculated that made him question his entire purchase. The vendor had seemed eager to complete the transaction rapidly, almost suspiciously so. Had he stumbled into some elaborate scheme? What manner of understandings? Boone inquired, though part of him feared the response. The tall woman's eyes sparkled with something beyond mere amusement. "The variety that involves your permanent residence here with us." She paused, allowing the words to register before delivering the revelation that would transform everything. "You're going to be intimate with us, Boone. All three of us. That's the arrangement." The declaration struck him like a physical impact, not from desire, but from the sheer boldness and menace they conveyed. This wasn't seduction. This was something entirely different, something that made his hand reflexively reach toward the rifle on his mount. But what precisely was he entering? And why did he possess the sinking sensation that his deed might prove worthless? Boone's hand halted midway toward his weapon as the implications of the woman's statement penetrated. This wasn't some crude advance from isolated frontier women. Their positioning, vocal confidence, casual mention of arrangements with a previous owner. Everything indicated something far more intricate and perilous than simple intimidation. "I don't understand what sort of scheme you're operating," Boone declared, forcing strength into his voice despite the uncertainty churning within. "But I invested substantial funds for this land, and I'm not departing." He dismounted deliberately, keeping his movements intentional and non-aggressive while maintaining eye contact with the leader. The tall woman laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Scheme? Oh, Boone, this isn't a scheme whatsoever. This is commerce." She gestured toward the farmhouse with a sweep of her muscular arm. "You see, the man who sold you this property owed us something. A debt that doesn't disappear simply because he fled with your payment." The redhead stepped forward, her boots heavy on the porch steps. Marcus Vance made commitments he couldn't fulfill, said he'd work the land with us, be our partner in multiple capacities. When that failed, he promised us the subsequent owner would honor his obligations. Her green eyes fixed on Boone with disturbing intensity. "That would be you." Boone felt genuine panic beginning. Marcus Vance. That was the seller's name, though the man had introduced himself as simply Mark. The details seemed too specific for fabrication, too personal. How much did these women actually know about his transaction? Even if that's accurate, which I question, no man can make commitments on behalf of another, especially not those types of commitments. The second woman, darker-haired and broader through the shoulders than the others, laughed. You truly don't comprehend how things function out here, do you? When you're this distant from civilization, from law, from any assistance, conventional rules don't operate. We create our own arrangements. Her emphasis on arrangements made Boone's skin crawl. He was beginning to grasp that this wasn't merely about money or property disputes. These women had established their own system, their own control method, and somehow his purchase had delivered him directly into their trap. The deed is legitimate, Boone maintained, though his confidence wavered. Filed with the territorial office, witnessed, sealed. Whatever Marcus Vance promised you personally has no connection to me. The leader's smile finally disappeared, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Legal documents mean nothing here when you're 3 days from the nearest sheriff and even further from anyone who might care what happens to a stranger. She stepped closer, and Boone was struck by her imposing nature. Easily 6 feet tall, with arms indicating years of hard physical labor. Furthermore, the redhead added, we possess our own documentation, contracts Marcus signed, agreements specifically mentioning the transfer of obligations to any future owner. She retrieved a folded paper from her pocket, and Boone's heart sank as he recognized what appeared to be official letterhead. The pieces were connecting, creating a picture that made Boone's investment seem less like a business transaction and more like an elaborate trap. Had Marcus Vance sold him into some kind of arrangement deliberately? Was this entire property sale a setup to deliver him to these women and whatever scheme they were operating? But something else existed in their demeanor, something he couldn't quite identify beneath the intimidation and threats. He sensed something almost like yearning, as if this wasn't entirely about control or money. The way the leader's eyes lingered on him, the subtle tension in the redhead stance. There were layers to this situation he didn't understand yet, and that uncertainty terrified him more than any straightforward threat could have. The document the redhead held appeared official enough to make Boone's mouth go dry. Even from several feet away, he could distinguish what seemed to be signatures and an official seal at the bottom. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Marcus Vance actually bound him to some kind of contract through the property sale? You're deceiving, Boone said, though his voice lacked conviction. No court would honor a contract involving forcing someone into whatever this is. The dark-haired woman stepped off the porch, her boots striking the ground with authority. Who mentioned courts? We handle our own justice here. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation, and Boone found himself taking an involuntary step backward. My name is Helena, the leader said, her tone shifting to something almost conversational. This is Ruth. She nodded toward the dark-haired woman and Magdalene. The redhead gave a small wave that somehow managed to be both friendly and threatening. We've been waiting for you for weeks, Boone. Marcus described you perfectly. The casual use of his first name sent another chill through him. How much had Marcus told them? What other details about his life did they know? Whatever Marcus told you about me, he had no right. I bought this property in good faith, and I'm not bound by any agreements he made. Helena's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, Boone caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath the intimidating exterior. Good faith, she repeated almost wistfully. That's refreshing. Marcus wasn't much for good faith, especially toward the end. She studied Boone's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You're different from him, quieter, more substantial. Ruth circled around to Boone's left side, moving like a predator, but with an odd gentleness in her eyes. Marcus was all charm and promises at first, swept in here talking about partnership, about building something together. 3 months later, he was already looking for an exit strategy. He used us, Magdalene added, her voice carrying a hurt that surprised Boone. Took advantage of our hospitality, our work, she paused, searching for the right word, affections, then decided it was too much trouble and ran off with the money from selling the land we improved. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a clearer picture, though it wasn't one that made Boone feel any safer. These women weren't just squatters or con artists. They had been betrayed by Marcus Vance, and now they saw Boone as either their salvation or their revenge. So you see, Helena continued, moving closer until she was close enough that Boone could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin. We have a legitimate claim here, not just the land, but to what we were promised, what Marcus committed to and then abandoned. Boone found himself studying her face, noticing details he had missed in his initial fear. The way her jaw set when she mentioned Marcus, the slight tremor in her hands when she spoke about betrayal. Whatever had happened between these women and his predecessor had left scars that ran deeper than property disputes. But there was something else in the way Helena looked at him, something that made his pulse quicken despite the dangerous situation. Was it possible that beneath all the intimidation and threats, there was genuine attraction? And more unsettling still, was he beginning to feel it too? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Boone found himself caught between the rational fear of his situation and an inexplicable pull toward these 3 women who had upended his carefully planned future. There was something magnetic about Helena's confidence, Ruth's quiet strength, and Magdalene's fierce independence that he couldn't ignore. "Show me this contract," Boone said finally, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "If Marcus really signed something that binds me, I have a right to see exactly what it says." Magdalene unfolded the document with deliberate care, and Boone stepped closer to examine it. The paper was thick, expensive, with Marcus Vance's signature clearly visible at the bottom alongside an official notary seal. But as Boone read the terms, his confusion deepened rather than cleared. "This is a partnership agreement," he said, looking up at Helena, "for farming operations, profit sharing." And he paused at a particularly unusual clause: mutual support and companionship for all parties involved. The language was carefully crafted, legally binding, but vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. "Marcus was clever with words," Ruth said, moving to stand beside Boone as he read. Her proximity was distracting. She was tall enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and he caught the scent of something warm and earthy, like fresh bread and summer rain. He made promises that sounded romantic but were actually business arrangements and vice versa. Helena watched Boone's face as he processed the document. "The land has been profitable under our management. We've built irrigation systems, improved the soil, established trade relationships with settlements 2 days' ride from here. Marcus benefited from our work for months before deciding he wanted out. But instead of honoring his commitments," Magdalene added, her green eyes flashing with renewed anger, "he found a buyer and disappeared with the money, leaving us with nothing but a piece of paper that apparently transfers his obligations to whoever bought the property." Boone set the contract down carefully, his mind working through the implications. These women had been more than partners to Marcus. They had been lovers, workers, and business associates rolled into one complex relationship. And according to this document, Marcus had legally bound any future property owner to step into his role. "Even if this contract is legitimate," Boone said slowly, "I didn't sign it." I can't be held responsible for agreements made by someone else, no matter what the paperwork says. Helena's expression shifted, and for a moment, Boone saw past the intimidating facade to something raw and vulnerable. "You're right," she said quietly. "Legally, you're probably not bound by Marcus' promises. But morally, we've invested everything into this land, into this arrangement. We have nowhere else to go." The admission hung in the air between them, changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. These weren't predators trying to trap him. They were women who had been abandoned and were desperately trying to protect what they had built. Ruth stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "We're not asking you to honor every detail of what Marcus promised, but we're asking you to consider that we might be able to build something better together than any of us could alone." Boone felt his resistance wavering as he looked at each of them in turn. Helena's strength masked a deep loneliness. Ruth's quiet confidence couldn't hide the hope in her eyes. Magdalene's fierce independence was built on a foundation of hurt that she was trying desperately to protect. "What exactly are you proposing?" Boone asked, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. The three women exchanged glances, and Boone realized that his answer would determine not just his immediate future, but potentially the rest of his life. Whatever came next, nothing would ever be simple again. Helena stepped forward, her imposing frame somehow less threatening now that Boone understood the pain behind her strength. "We're proposing a real partnership," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Not the half-hearted arrangement Marcus offered, but something genuine. We work the land together, share the profits equally, and—" she paused, meeting his eyes directly, "we share our lives." The weight of her words settled over them like morning mist. Boone found himself studying each woman with new eyes, seeing past the intimidation to the loneliness that had driven them to this desperate gambit. They weren't trying to trap him. They were trying to save themselves and offer him something he hadn't even realized he was looking for. "The three of you," Boone said slowly, testing the waters. "You've been together since Marcus left." The question carried implications that made his heart race with a mixture of curiosity and unexpected desire. Ruth nodded, a faint blush coloring her strong features. "We found comfort in each other after he abandoned us. It started as survival, but it became something more, something we didn't want to lose." Her honesty was disarming, and Boone felt his carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Magdalene moved to stand beside her companions, creating a united front that was no longer threatening but strangely appealing. "We know how it sounds," she said, her green eyes locked on his. Three women asking a stranger to join them in something most people would never understand. But out here, conventional rules don't apply. We make our own family, our own bonds. Boone's mind raced through the possibilities and consequences. He had come here seeking solitude and a fresh start, but what they were offering was the opposite: connection, partnership, and an intimacy that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but another part, a part he had long suppressed, whispered that this might be exactly what he needed. "The physical aspect," Boone said, his voice rougher than he intended. "What would that mean exactly?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and uncertainty. Helena's smile returned, but this time it was genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time since he had arrived. "It would mean whatever feels natural to all of us," she said simply. "No pressure, no demands, just the freedom to explore what develops between us as we build something together." The honesty in her response surprised him. This wasn't about coercion or fulfilling some obligation to Marcus. This was about four people finding solace and connection in an isolated world where traditional relationships often meant nothing. "And if it doesn't work?" Boone asked, though even as he spoke, he could feel his resistance weakening. There was something about the way Ruth's eyes softened when she looked at him, the way Magdalene's fierce independence seemed to include space for him, the way Helena's strength promised protection rather than domination. "Then we figured out like adults," Ruth said simply. "But Boone, we've been watching you since you arrived. The way you handle yourself, the respect you showed even when you were frightened. We think could work. We hope it will." The admission that they had been evaluating him just as much as he had been evaluating them somehow made the proposition feel more balanced, less like a trap and more like an opportunity. But was he brave enough to take it? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Boone weighed the most important decision of his life. Everything about this situation defied convention, challenged every assumption he had made about his future. And yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward these three remarkable women who had turned his world upside down. "I need to see what you've built here," Boone said finally, his practical nature asserting itself even as his heart raced with possibility. "If we're talking about partnership, I need to understand what I'm partnering with." Helena's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it behind her usual confidence. "Of course, Ruth, show him the irrigation system you designed." The pride in her voice when she spoke of Ruth's accomplishments was unmistakable, and Boone found himself drawn to the genuine affection these women shared for each other. As Ruth led him toward the fields, Boone was amazed by the sophistication of the water management system she had created. Channels carved with precision-directed water from a natural spring to carefully planned garden plots and grain fields that showed signs of careful cultivation and impressive yields. "This represents months of work," Ruth explained, her hands gesturing gracefully as she described the engineering challenges she had overcome. Marcus took credit for it when traders came through, but every inch was planned and dug by us. The bitterness in her voice when she mentioned Marcus was matched by the pride she took in her creation. Magdalene joined them as they toured the livestock areas, where healthy cattle grazed in well-maintained pastures, and a small but productive chicken coop provided fresh eggs. "We've established trade relationships with 3 different settlements," she explained, her business acumen evident in the way she discussed profit margins and seasonal planning. "The operation is not just sustainable, it's thriving." Boone found himself genuinely impressed by what the 3 women had accomplished. This wasn't just a farm. It was a carefully planned and expertly managed operation that had the potential to support all of them comfortably. More than that, it represented a level of cooperation and shared vision that he had never experienced. "The house," Helena said as they returned to the main building, "has 4 bedrooms. We've been using 3, but we always hoped." She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air between them. As they entered the farmhouse, Boone was struck by the warmth and comfort of the space. It wasn't luxurious, but everything was well-crafted and carefully maintained. The kitchen was large enough for communal cooking. The sitting area had comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, and everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of the care and attention these women had invested in creating a real home. "We're not asking for an answer today," Ruth said as they settled in the sitting area, her understanding evident in her gentle tone. "This is a big decision, and we want you to be certain before you commit to anything." But even as she spoke, Boone realized that his decision was already made. The attraction he felt wasn't just physical, though he couldn't deny the way his pulse quickened when Helena's hand brushed his arm, or how Ruth's smile made him feel understood in ways he had never experienced, or how Magdalene's fierce independence drew him like a flame. More than attraction, he felt the pull of belonging. These women had created something remarkable together, and they were offering him the chance to be part of it. The risks were enormous, but so was the potential reward. What happens next? Boone asked, and all three women smiled, understanding that his question was really an answer. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, Boone felt truly alive. That evening, as they shared a meal prepared together in the spacious kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to cautious optimism. Boone found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected, drawn into easy conversation about farming techniques, trade routes, and the challenges of frontier life. The three women moved around each other with practiced ease, their partnership evident in every shared glance and completed task. "There's something else you should know," Helena said as they cleared the dishes, her tone carrying a weight that made everyone pause. "Marcus left us with more than just broken promises. There are debts he incurred in our name, people who expect payment that we can't provide alone." The admission hit Boone like cold water. "What kind of debts?" he asked, setting down the plate he had been drying. Magdalene pulled a ledger from a drawer, her expression grim. "Supplies he ordered, but never paid for. Equipment purchased on credit. He used our reputation with local traders to secure goods, then disappeared before the bills came due." She opened the book, revealing columns of numbers that made Boone's heart sink. "How much?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Enough to ruin us if we can't pay," Ruth said quietly. "The traders have been patient because they know our work is good, but patience has limits. If we can't settle these accounts within the month, we'll lose everything we've built here." Boone studied the ledger, his business sense taking over despite the emotional complexity of the situation. The debts were significant, but not insurmountable, especially given the productivity he had witnessed. More importantly, the women's honesty about the financial burden impressed him. They could have hidden this information until after he committed, but instead they were laying all their cards on the table. "Marcus really did a number on you," Boone said, his anger at the absent man growing. "But these numbers, they're manageable with the right approach." He looked up to find all three women watching him hopefully. "I have capital from selling my previous holdings, enough to settle these debts and invest in expanding the operation." The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. Helena's composure finally cracked, tears she had been holding back for months spilling over. Ruth reached for his hand, her grip firm and grateful. Magdalene simply nodded, but her eyes spoke volumes about what his offer meant to them. "But I have conditions," Boone continued, his tone growing serious. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Legal partnership papers, clear agreements about responsibilities and decision-making." He paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "And we take time to let the personal relationships develop naturally. No pressure, no expectations beyond what feels right to all of us." Helena wiped her eyes, her smile returning stronger than before. "That's all we ever wanted, Boone. A real partnership with someone who sees us as equals, not objects or conveniences." As the evening deepened, they sat together planning their future, and Boone realized that what had started as the worst day of his life might actually be the beginning of the best chapter he had ever lived. 3 months later, Boone stood in the same farmyard where he had first encountered the three women who had changed his life forever. The operation had expanded beyond their wildest expectations, with new livestock, improved irrigation, and trade agreements that stretched across 3 territories. More importantly, the 4 of them had found a rhythm that worked both professionally and personally. Helena had become his closest confidant in matters of business strategy, her natural leadership complementing his financial acumen. Their relationship had deepened slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection that had blossomed into something neither had expected to find. Ruth's gentle wisdom and innovative thinking had made her indispensable as a partner, and the quiet moments they shared working together had developed into a connection that felt as natural as breathing. Magdalene had been the most cautious about opening her heart again, but her fierce loyalty and passionate spirit had eventually won out over her protective instincts. The morning she had first kissed him, spontaneous and unplanned as they worked side by side repairing fence posts, had marked a turning point for all of them. The arrangement that had seemed so impossible on that first day had evolved into something beautiful and functional. They had created their own family, their own rules, their own definition of love that worked for all four of them. There were challenges, certainly, jealousy to navigate, decisions to make collectively, and the constant awareness that their lifestyle would never be accepted by conventional society. But the rewards far outweighed the difficulties. The legal papers had been drawn up and signed, creating an official partnership that protected all of their interests. The debts Marcus had left behind were settled, and the farm now operated in the black with healthy profits that they reinvested in both the business and their shared home. More rooms had been added to accommodate their growing success, including a proper office where they managed their expanding trade relationships. Boone had never been happier. The loneliness that had driven him to seek isolation in the first place had been replaced by a richness of connection he had never imagined possible. Each woman brought something unique to their partnership: Helena's strength, Ruth's innovation, and Magdalene's passion. Together, they had built something that was greater than the sum of its parts. As evening approached, the four of them gathered on the porch that had been expanded to accommodate their family dinners and evening conversations. The view stretched across fertile fields and healthy pastures, evidence of what they had accomplished together. "Any regrets?" Helena asked, settling beside Boone as Ruth and Magdalene joined them with cups of coffee and the comfortable silence that came with complete acceptance. Boone looked at each of them in turn. These remarkable women who had confronted him with an impossible proposition that had turned out to be the answer to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. The conventional life he had planned seemed pale and empty compared to the vivid reality they had created together. "Only one," he said, drawing surprised looks from all three. "I regret that it took Marcus Vance's betrayal to bring us together. We could have been doing this even longer." Their laughter carried across the evening air, the sound of people who had found exactly where they belonged. In a world that demanded conformity, they had chosen connection. In a society that insisted on conventional relationships, they had created their own definition of love. And in that choice, they had found something precious and enduring that would sustain them through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and unexpected partnerships collide in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.